friends, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori, and today we are going to talk about the books that I read in the month of October. So I read a grand total of 8 books slash stories, short stories again this month, and I feel like I've gotten back into a pretty steady rhythm when it comes to my reading during the months. As some of you already know, it has been a little bit of a tricky balance trying to read and do content for the channel and also keep up with my writing schedule. I am planning on releasing another book in early 2025, so I'm just kind of all over the place right now, but I have still been reading some really great books and I'm excited to talk to you guys about them. The first book that I finished in October was Senin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. This is the first book in his Books of Babel series, which is 4 books long, and this is one of my husband's favorite series of all time. He binge read this last year, and I have not seen him binge a series like this in so long that I knew right away as soon as he finished it and he gushed about it and was so excited about me reading it that I promised that I would read all 4 books in the series for him so that we can talk about it. And I did finish the first book in October. The thing with Senin Ascends, this is a very unique world building style story. There's a lot of, it's a little bit slower and more contemplative than a lot of the fantasy we're used to. And I actually really like that because I think that it just goes to show how broad the genre is in terms of different storytelling structures and style. And it's really important, I think, to read as much of a variety within that genre as we can. Senin is the story of a man who brings his young new bride to the Tower of Babel, which is like this destination touristy place within their country. It is a, as you might imagine, huge tower. You can't see the top of it. And they get there and they have this expectation that they're going to have this really lovely honeymoon and see all the different floors of the tower, and it's going to be a great time. And then reality hits, because when they get there, Senin loses his young wife in the crowd and now has to undertake this journey through the rings of the tower to find her, and he discovers very quickly that the tower is very different in the tourist guidebook than it is in reality. Senin as a main character is very subversive of your typical fantasy hero tropes. He is very gullible, he trusts people too easily, which gets him in a lot of trouble. He is very methodical, he is very thoughtful, and he's a school teacher, so he has kind of, you know, a little bit of a this is the way things should be in his head, and the tower is challenging that mindset at every possible step. And as you make your way through the tower with Senin, more and more of the bigger picture of the place and the story as a whole starts to form, and you start to get a better idea of what the story is going to be about. I liked this first installment of the book. One of the things that frustrated me a little bit about it is I felt like I was getting teased with a motley crew through the entire book, and I never really got one. And I've been told that that improves in the next few books, so I'm really looking forward to that because that's something that I really like in storytelling, and I did feel like I was kind of plodding along with Senin quite a bit in this first book. I think that Josiah Bancroft's prose is really beautiful. There were quite a few sections of this that I paused and I went back and reread it just because it was really profound or really beautiful the way that it was written. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the series because I think, from what I've been told by my friends that have read the series, book 2 is really gonna be more in my wheelhouse in terms of tropes and structure. So I have the first book done under my belt, and now I'm going to move on to the second book, hopefully in the month of November here, so we'll see how that goes. The next book that I finished in October, I was reading kind of at the same time, and this was a doorstopper 1,000-page chunker book, and it is the second book in the War-Formed Stormweaver series by Bryce O'Connor. And the first book I talked about last month is Iron Prince, and I absolutely loved this book, you guys. You heard my gush review of it. I did a dedicated review video for this book. I absolutely loved this, and so immediately I wanted to jump on book 2. Fire and Song is, I think, a really good sequel to Iron Prince. It continues a lot of the things that I loved so much about the first book. I do think that in this one, things dragged a tiny bit in some places. The pacing is still really good for how big of a book this is, but I feel like we could have maybe gotten through more time than we did in 1,000 pages. And there were a couple of storytelling things that I felt I didn't really jive with as much. It felt a little bit more, I felt the author voice coming through a little bit too much in a couple of spots. However, I still feel like if you liked book 1, you're gonna love a lot more of what comes up in book 2, because we continue the journey with these characters that we absolutely love. And honestly, I never thought that progression fantasy would be something I really loved, but this book has really made me a believer. I don't know that, I think it's a combination of some very specific elements within this series that made me fall in love with it. So I don't know if that's going to extend to other series, but I have been recommended a few others by friends of mine that I'm going to try to see if I can recreate that experience in the future. But yeah, Fire and Song, I feel like, is a really solid sequel to Iron Prince. I did like the first book better, but I'm now in that position where I am going to be chewing my nails down to stubs until book 3 comes out, because it's not out, and it's kind of killing me a little bit, because all I want to do is keep reading about these characters. I love them so much. If you want to know more about my thoughts on the series, please go watch my dedicated review, because I gush about Iron Prince and all of the things that I loved about it and why it's so good. But if you're just looking to start a series that is a progression cyberpunk sci-fi with some incredible character work, give it a shot. Next up was my audiobook listen for the month, and that was Mort by Terry Pratchett. This is book 1 in his Death Cycle series within the Discworld universe. And as you guys know, I have been loving the City Watch. My husband and I are on book 4 of the City Watch, and he had already read Mort, so I thought, you know what, why not? Let's jump into another area of Discworld and see what Terry Pratchett has. I really enjoyed my time with this book. Mort is an absolutely delightful protagonist. Basically, the premise of this is a young, very awkward teenage boy who is kind of the head scratcher for the rest of his family. He's very thoughtful. He's very different. He gets picked up as an apprentice by Death, and is being taught the tools of the trade of ferrying souls from one world to the next. And it's delightful. Mort is such a good protagonist. He's precious, and I love him so much. He doesn't quite beat out Carrot from City Watch. If you know, you know. But I really enjoyed this a lot. I liked the beginning half, actually, I think more than the second half. But again, the thing I'm going to say about this is Pratchett's humor is so on point. He is so good at taking the mundane and the everyday and making it relatable and funny while weaving it into this very imaginative, vibrant fantasy world that he's created. And I'm just in awe of his storytelling style. I do feel like, as I've read almost 5 books of his now, the endings are a little mushy sometimes for Pratchett, I think. But overall, I love this book. I had a really good time with it. I'm excited to keep going in this series as well as the City Watch. And honestly, I would recommend this as another really good entry point for the Discworld, because it gives you a lot of insight into what you're going to be experiencing within the Discworld as a whole. And again, because I have to say this every single time I talk about any Terry Pratchett books, please, 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 if you like audiobooks and you have the opportunity, please listen to these books. John Culshaw does the City Watch books, and I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who reads the Death Cycle. She's a brilliant actress, was amazing also at this. So if you can do the audiobook versions, please do, because they are so well produced and the voice acting is S tier. Next up, I finished a novella called Revenge of the Thousands by Michael Roberti. This is a prequel to his Crown and Tide series that is ongoing. I think he has book 3 in the works or out recently. But this just kind of is a prequel to the conflict that starts in The Traitors We Are, which is book 1 of Crown and Tide. And it kind of sets up a little bit of the behind the scenes of these different families that are in conflict with each other. This is a solid medieval, like Western European clash of houses kind of story. And I actually feel like, for me at least, I would have liked to start with The Traitors We Are and then go back and read this, because I did feel like it really took me a little bit of time to get settled into who was who. There's a lot of characters introduced in a very short space of time. So I actually think if I could go back and do it again, I would probably start with The Traitors We Are and then go back and read the prequel. And I would love to know, anybody in the comments, if you've read this series, let me know what your experience was with that and if you agree with me or not, because maybe that was just me. But it is action-packed for a novella. There's a ton of action in it. There's a lot of setup. This is a grimdark series. You're going to have a lot of betrayals. You're going to have a lot of war conflict and how it's affecting the different families and how all of the characters are coping with it, all of that kind of stuff. So if you're looking for a series in that vein, I would recommend starting with the book 1, The Traitors We Are, and then going back to the prequel novella. But you can also start with the prequel novella, Revenge of the Thousands. All right, next up is a book that will probably surprise some of you when I hold it up. That is Happy Place by Emily Henry. Emily Henry is a very, very popular contemporary romance author, and a few of my friends that have really enjoyed her work this year were like, Tori, I know you don't like romance. Try this one because her character work is phenomenal. So I said, okay, and I went to the library and I picked up Happy Place. She hasn't made me a believer with this one book, and I am committed to trying at least one more of her books, because I feel like the particular romance trope that she uses in Happy Place really didn't work for me, so I would like to see what she does with something else when it comes to romance tropes. And what I mean by that is basically the super nutshell premise of Happy Place is a group of friends that have known each other since college all go to this wonderful, idyllic place every year as their kind of, week-long friends bash where they get a break from all of their crazy, hectic lives, and they just have a really good time together, and it's kind of a recharge for all of them. Two of the friends were engaged, broke off their engagement because of something that happened. They decide that they want to pretend that they're still together because they don't want their friends they don't want to ruin the week, essentially. I hated that premise, to be perfectly honest. It really bothered me because the way that it was set up was this idea that, like, oh, we had this horrible, awful thing happen between the two of us that gets revealed, obviously, later in the book, but we have to pretend to like each other in front of our friends. And that immediately just put me in the wrong mindset, because I was like, if you have to hide stuff like that from your friends, I get the idea of not wanting to, like, ruin an atmosphere. And it does go into the fact that, both of these characters are very people-pleasy. But it just made me frustrated because the premise felt pretty weak to me. And the fact that they were all over each other mentally from, like, the second... I don't know, you guys, like, one of the things that I have a really hard time relating to that I seem to find in a lot of contemporary stories like this is the idea that the most fun thing to do with your friends is just to, like, drink yourself into oblivion and get high. I don't relate to that. So the friend group in this story, I didn't really feel immersed in their world. I don't know. It's just kind of like, you do you, boo-boo, but that would not be my idea of a wonderful, relaxing recharge week. What I really liked about this book that I kind of wish had been more of the focus is the themes of what happens to friendships when you grow up, when you've left behind that kind of college atmosphere and you start moving into different phases of your life, and how does that impact the relationships, the friendships. She had a lot of really interesting things to say about that, and I felt like it was kind of buried within this very heavy-handed romance trope that for me really didn't work and felt forced and frustrating, and the ending didn't bring me any kind of joy. So like, I don't know, I'm kind of a curmudgeon when it comes to romance because I don't relate to a lot of books that define romance this way. So that's just me. I'm not a romance reader, guys. I still haven't been convinced, and Emily Henry did not do it with Happy Place, but I am going to potentially try one more of her books to see what she does with a different trope. Next up, I read Different Not Damaged by Andy Peliquin. This was my first read by Andy. He is a pretty prolific indie author. He's written a ton of grimdark assassin style dark fantasy, and I'm really excited to get to those series as well. But I had seen that he had this short story collection where he takes the fantasy world that he's created for his other series, and he delves into different mental illnesses in some of the short stories in this book. And I really liked that direction for this short story collection. I thought he did a really good job overall with it. It's very... He did a good job of creating the whole story in a very short space, giving us enough of the story and the characters to hook our interest and give us a good sense of who these characters were. I do think, again, like I said with the other prequel novella that I read this month, I do feel like I would have gotten more out of this if I had read some of his other series work first. Because one of the things I really struggle with is immersing in a fantasy world within the space of a short story. I think that that's really hard to do, especially with something that's epic fantasy. It is hard to really give us enough information. So I did struggle with that a little bit, and I felt like I wish I would have read some of his other work before going into this one, but I do still feel like there's a lot here for somebody who's looking to get kind of a taste test of Andy's writing style, and it did make me really look forward to checking out his bigger series as well. So finished that, and then I read another short story called Worse Than Dying by, let me remind myself, Brett Van Valkenburg. This short story was kind of it's a horror read. It's about a zombie apocalypse and a family that's trying to survive, and it's very Walking Dead. So if you're a Walking Dead fan, it felt like reading a kind of side quest on Walking Dead, a little bit of a character completely unrelated to any of the characters in the shows. I like the way that the zombies are utilized both in Walking Dead and also it's a very similar style in this story, with a little bit of a caveat where there's almost a little bit more sentience played with the zombies in this story, which I thought was really interesting. But the author decided to lean on a story structure that includes some pretty heavy trigger warnings in terms of sexual violence. Obviously, if you want to know more about that, let me know. So personally, I didn't really love the direction he took with it, but I will say that the tension was really well done. The feeling of dread with the zombies and all of that was really well done. So if you're a Walking Dead fan, this might be one to check out, but do be aware that there is some content in there that is a little bit heavy. Last but not least, my final read of the month was The Bloody Chorus by John Marco. This was a Discord read for my private Discord where we talked about, a few of us got together and we read this and are sharing our thoughts as we go through it. This is one of the most unique and bingeable world-building fantasies I have read in a while. It's hard to explain. There's so many things in this book. I couldn't put it down. I really had a hard time shutting the book at the end of the day. And he does such a good job of building tension, and sometimes the way he would switch between POVs in a conflict scene was just brilliant. But the basic premise of this book is you have the Cryori, which is a group of it's a fantasy race of people who worship these old present gods, and they're very earth and sea based characters that actually do show up on page, and they don't feel like just other humans. He did such a good job of making these gods feel non-human and ancient and just having a completely different mindset of the world than any of the mortal characters involved in the page. And this group of Cryori are at odds with a nation or an alliance of nations called the Jorah, who used to be subservient to them and are now this massive force that are threatening to completely take over and annihilate the Cryori way of life, etc., etc. The characters in this book, at its heart, this is a coming-of-age novel, because our protagonist, Haru, who is the new leader of his Cryori people after his father is murdered, has to gather a group of advisors and warriors around him to try to make peace or figure out if they can take out the leader of this Jorah alliance. And Haru's coming-of-age arc through this book is really interesting, and I really liked the way that John Marco built it through the pages. There's some great naval battles in here. There's some really good motley crew in here. Some really good magician. There's werewolves in here, which I was not expecting, but I loved that. That was really cool. Shape-shifting kind of werewolf characters. It's really interesting, and I think it gets darker and darker as the story goes on, so be aware of that. There are some very grimdark sections of this book. But I was pleasantly surprised by this. I was really impressed with this book, and I think it has a lot of really interesting world building and character work in here, and I would highly recommend it if any of that sounds interesting. Okay, so if I had to pick a book of the month, I don't know, you guys. Like, there are some really, I would say it's between Mort, Fire and Song, and Bloody Chorus. In terms of just overall enjoyment, I have to give it to Fire and Song because I love those characters so much. I would actually say Bloody Chorus is a very close second, though. I was really intrigued by it a lot, and even though there were certain aspects of it that I didn't love as much or was kind of not sure how I felt about, I feel like overall it was a really solid read. So yeah, I would love to know down in the comments below what your book of the month was. What did you read this month? Let me know. I hope you guys are reading 5-star reads, whatever they might be, and that you're having a great week, and I will see you in the next video.